slides like,
Okay, I think we're good to start. So good morning or good afternoon, wherever this panel might find you, and welcome. I am Paula Gil Baizan, and I lead NRC's global work on innovation and digital. We have a stellar group of people today, and I'm sure we're going to have a fantastic conversation. Humanitarian and development agencies around the world are rushing towards this utopia of digital transformation. It has become a no-brainer, literally, the push to digitize our services. Donors want to fund it, agencies have it in their strategies. So all of us would like to take a moment to question what seems to be the unquestionable of the moment. So what is the added value, and for whom digitizing our services brings any value? So does it really make any sense for us to make our humanitarian and development services digital in the places where we work and the people we're meant to serve? Does that add any value to them? Does this rush to digitize the services we provide make sense in places where connectivity is poor and internet shutdowns are constant and persistent? Does it make sense to make digital our interactions with the most vulnerable people in the world when they live in places where energy is expensive and hard to come by? So we have gathered a stellar group of brains, and we're hoping to have a conversation about what are some of the unintended consequences of bringing the ideas of digital transformation into the humanitarian and development world, because there are lots of Black Mirror scenarios in which this goes really poorly, but it doesn't have to be this way. So today, I hope we can explore the different layers of complexity in the transition between the physical and the digital space of delivery of aid. So we have three fantastic panelists. We have Dragana Karen, who's the executive director at the Localization Lab. We have Ziad Ashkar, who's a research affiliate at the Better Evidence Project. And we have Rakesh Baharania, who's the director of humanitarian impact data for Salesforce. So over to you to introduce yourselves and set the scene for our chat. Dragana, can you kick us off? Where do we start with this conversation?
Hi, Paula. Thanks for having me today. Many places to kick off, but I think we're all very like-minded and we'll have a good time chatting today. But I think maybe looking first at information systems and what they look like before adding technology is oftentimes skipped, which is how we get to problems like techno-solutionism of choosing ICTs that don't work, for example, choosing technologies that work for us, but not communities that we work for, skipping information entirely that addresses these communities. For example, like with the ICRC hack that happened, we're talking a lot about how to address this, but I've yet to see questions about, and I've yet to see how the biggest question of how we're relaying this information to people whose information was hacked, and what they can do to mitigate risks for themselves. But it's a system, I think, on this intersection of technology and humanitarian aid. These are two systems that are very heavily built on colonial lines, and so it's very difficult to address this with and impossible to address this with silver bullet solutions. as we've said many times before, and we just never keep, we keep, I guess, not learning the same lesson.
Thank you, Dragan. Ziad, on the aspects of learning the same lessons, what have we learned?
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Yeah, really good question. It's tough to think about what have we learned when we keep seeing critical risk incidents happening over and over and over again. I think what we've learned in the last 10 years is that as a sector, we lack proper mechanisms for accountability to the affected populations that we work with. I think that's the big lessons that I take from a decade of doing this. So before I think we really dive into digital tech and solutions, I think we need to establish proper accountability mechanisms, which the humanitarian sector is unfortunately not designed in a way to be actually accountable, or accountable as the degree it has to be to the affected populations we work with. And so that's, I think, one of the big gaps right now. The other second one that often comes up in the research and work that I do is a capacity issue. Yes, donors want to fund things, but they want to fund the exciting, the kind of shiny objects, shiny tools. But a lot of the work requires investment in capacity that's maintenance, that's support staff, that's IT, that's training, a lot of money that's not the most exciting thing that donors want to fund, or they fund it for short term and then they move on to something else. So I think accountability and capacity are the two big issues facing us right now that we have to really get right before we can dive deeper into kind of this digital tech transformation.
Thanks, Ziad. Rakesh, what do you think?
It's really interesting because I agree with my co-panelists on their observations about the challenges facing technology in the sector right now. But of course, I work for the private sector. I work for a tech company that sells to the sector. And so I think that one thing that we can dive into here is really the role of private sector entities in this digitized humanitarian sector. It might be surprising, but even for many years, I've said that technology has never saved a single human life or rescued someone from poverty. Humans do those things. Technology doesn't. When it works, technology makes more of those moments possible, right? When it works, it's working to scale human intention and human capacities for empathy and compassion and humanitarianism, and that's what we seek, nominally. But as the philosopher Jacques Derrida said, context is everything. And it is really important that when we go and bring technology into humanitarian and development environments, we recognize two fundamental truths. One is that data is always about people. Even if you have things like machine data or other forms of more abstract data, data should, always at the end of the day, ties back to human beings. And the second thing is that data is a form of power. And this is a thing that as computer scientists, as engineers, your technologists may not be super aware of these kind of dynamics. But going back to Ziad's comment, I think that understanding that data is a form of power is necessary to establishing the appropriate accountability and controls here. And what I think the one thing that we can also do is work with the donor community to educate them about the notion of infrastructure. Infrastructure is not glamorous. It's that 2 cents out of every dollar that isn't going to feeding a hungry kid. But this lack of infrastructure funding and shortchanging it, there's a colloquialism in American English that says that you're penny wise and pound foolish, in that you see a lot of duplication and lack of capacity and a lack of enterprise architecture in humanitarian organizations. So that one a NGO that's operating in Ethiopia that I'm aware of has 5 different feedback systems, as opposed to one consolidated feedback system that can be appropriately used by 5 different programs. And it's just because of the way of the funding works. So I think that's another area that needs to be understood as we brought into this conversation. But I'm happy to join all my panelists. I'm happy to join all of the audience.
Dragan, I could see that you were going like, and then like, yeah. What do you think?
Well, what came to mind First of all, design, when we talk about design of technology, design is very political. Who gets to design and who we're designing for matters. Looking at a non-tech innovation item, like the IKEA shelters, for example, that were designed, initially I think they caught on fire pretty quickly, which is like when the Swiss government bought them, they were like, we can't use these, during the refugee crisis, the beginning of the refugee crisis, 2015, 2016, sent them back, but then they were still sending them to parts of, of Africa and Middle East. And when asked, isn't this the same product? The response was, well, the standards are different for Switzerland and for Kenya. So, and then the question also of these IKEA shelters, I meant to work for 3 years, 3 to 5 years. Yes, they're better than living in a tent, but an innovation like this is still sending the message you're only here temporarily when people are refugees today are in very long emergencies, right? 5 years plus. It doesn't exactly send the message, we're here to welcome you, we're here to help you. And that's just one example. Another one is very quickly from what Rakesh said. I met a local group in Lesbos a few years ago who uses WhatsApp. And people coming, on boats coming into Greece, to the 5 islands, are using WhatsApp as well to communicate with each other, to send locations, because boats get, help me out here, overcrowded. This is when we're talking about use of technology, people are able to use these themselves also. They're not also, but they should be able to use these themselves. People are very much capable of using technologies, that already exist out there, and creating their own. When we're focusing so much on creating new things to help people without them being in the room whatsoever. Yeah, so I wanted to add those 2 points, and then of course I feel like we'll get into public-private partnerships at some point, with working with like somebody like Salesforce, which is inevitable today, like for a lot of humanitarian organizations, but comes with a lot of issues that we haven't resolved.
That's really interesting, because I think for me, one of the important things to talk about here is that when we're talking about digital transformation, we're not only talking about the move from paper to electrons and bits in terms of how we produce stuff for people. We're talking about the whole system changing. We're talking about like how aid is perceived, how aid is made sense of, like how are services shaped and built. And so when we use this really broad term, digital transformation of aid, we're not talking about another platform or digitizing our records of people only. We're talking about the transition of the experience, right? Not only of receiving assistance, but also of delivering that assistance, and all of the things that come with that in terms of the business models, the policies, the risk profiles, the funding frameworks. So I want us to focus at that level. I feel like at that level of complexity of digital transformation, what are the things that we need to look out for? Because if we're just ending up in, yes, context is everything, we're not really even touching like the degree of complexity that jumping into a whole different system entails, no? What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's absolutely a component there. When you look at humanitarian organizations, many of them lose up to 30% of their staff year over year in the field, just from burnout and transitions and the various usual things. And so the digital capacities, like the digital skills of the field to absorb and sustain technology, In my own estimation, working with humanitarians for all these years, a lot of the conversations are really focused on the front end, like what do we need to do in order to get out the door? How do we build this? How do we deploy this? How do we get this out the door and close out the project essentially? But honestly, that's like 20% of the problem, because the other 80% is what happens to that project for the duration of that project, because sustainability and supportability are absolutely key. Especially when you're talking about systems that collect personal data or that might be especially, ripe for exploitation, that those systems have to be maintained to remain secure or protective, right? It's not just a one-time activity. And one thing that we've seen is that, again, the sort of over-focus on the front end without enough buy-in and capacity and sustainment on the back end, and sort of right sizing that calibration is really important. And I think that there's two, in economics, there's this phrase called an opportunity cost. When you choose to do one thing, you're choosing not to do everything else. And I remember, so I worked for the American Red Cross during September 11th, 2001. And one of my first things I did on that day was actually take what was essentially an RFL, restoring a family link kind of conversation. A woman had their adult daughter in one of the World Trade Center towers, and she called me up, and I had been put on a phone, given a pad of paper and a pen, and just asked to write down everything that someone would call into this phone bank with. Now, I knew that there had to be a technology solution for this, because there was I knew that nothing was going to come from this paper. Like there was no process, there was nothing. It was completely improvised. And so I think that, yeah, we need to design technology intentionally and safely and contextually. But I also think that we do ourselves no favor if we miss the opportunities that technology can give us. And that's not techno-solutionism, that's not techno-utopianism. I think we can do both, and I think we ought to be doing both in a sense of being realistic about its limitations and its promises.
To quickly jump off Rakesh's point, I think, and Dragana's point earlier about there's inevitable that we're going to have to be, as a humanitarian sector, engaging with in public-private partnerships, right? So the work that we're doing, around the world means that humanitarian organizations have to negotiate with mobile network providers. And so that raises questions, do we have the capacity, the expertise within humanitarian organizations on a national or ground level to be able to negotiate with these organizations, to know what to look for in terms of data protection and data responsibility, what kind of, collection of what kind of data is going to be collected. The other thing is, one of the most fascinating things that's happened in the sector over the last 5 years is this evolution of cash aid and mobile banking and the ability to provide resources a lot faster. But the flip side of it, an example as a Lebanese is oftentimes that means you're dealing with banks, and banks sometimes have different incentive mechanisms. In the case of Lebanon, about like 40% of the aid was lost because of currency conversions and the financial crisis. And so these are real political economy questions that we cannot escape. So tech is not going to solve our political economy problems. Like, that is the reality. Tech is not going to solve our structural problems. One of my favorite comments that I got from research I'm doing right now is, we know that attacks against health workers is a violation of international law. It's a violation of Geneva Conventions, violation of IHL. Building a data set that says this is a hospital is not the solution. The solution is stop bombing hospitals. And so if we're not really talking about kind of these political, structural, and political economy issues, we're not going to get much further than we are right now, frankly. It was a digital solution at whatever level we're in. And so I think that's important to also keep in mind as we engage in these conversations, because it gets very complex on the tech aspects of it, that we tend to forget, well, there's a political component to this that I think drives a lot of these issues.
And I want to challenge us a little bit, because otherwise this will be like so boring if we all believe in the same thing, right? But you said, so technology is not going to solve our structural problems. And I like to understand why not. The humanitarian sector is already pretty broken. I would like to see some actual shaking up, not in terms of doing more of what we do, but doing things differently. So to give you an example, we currently collect reams of data around people's needs. We do almost nothing with those, that inside those inputs. And we also pretend that that data is perfect, that we actually know what people need. When as a matter of fact, we have granularity on what people think we want to hear. And we have granularity that is only half of the loop, because we don't necessarily have that same level of quantity or granularity in terms of how do people use and experience what we provide. So I like to imagine that there is another parallel world where we are actually using humanitarian technology to actually close the loop and use it to understand people really, really well. Not so that it's freaky how much they know about me, but to use it so that I can actually improve my activity as a designer of services that actually not only improve people's lives, but accompanies them and respects the fact that this is one of the worst moments in people's lives. So they should be able to receive the best service ever. So why can't technology do that? Why can't technology fix the broken structure?
Because it's not designed for that, right? More simply, I mean, we to your point earlier, we could mix this up a little bit, because, or we can just scream for the rest of this panel in unison together. I think it would be cathartic. But it was designed to work for organizations. It was designed like for organizations that have money, organizations that get funding from donors, to Rakesh's earlier point, who have a lot of opinions about how it should be used. It's not just about, and I'm saying this having worked with communities directly who used these technologies, like at a local level for 8-9 years now. I mean, it starts with this is not accessible to, this is not designed for me whatsoever, and this is designed against me. Actually, it's designed to exclude me from participating in these conversations. I mean, and one example being, so many conversations like this happen in forums. I mean, forums like these that are in English and that are not, I mean, that are not accessible to people maybe who are beneficiaries. Are there forums where beneficiaries could participate in directly in discourse like this?
Rakesh, Ziad, what do you think?
I think that there are examples of systems that have been very helpful when they are designed for the local individuals in the local context. And one example that I can think of is Signpost by, so this is an effort between Mercy Corps and IRC and NRC in different areas to deal with refugee information flow, right? So, and the first place where Signpost was deployed was in Greece in 2015 during the height of the Syrian migration from Turkey into Greece and into Europe. And what it did, so for the first time, that I recall, humanitarians were actually expected to provide digital services to people carrying modern smartphones that were, that their entire lives were on this device. So they already know how to use their device. It was their personal device. It was their lifeline. And now I needed to provide information to those individuals about, like, what island am I on and where is the place where I can buy the tickets, and some very relevant and like essentially local knowledge. And it was really designed so that those users could, it was in their language, it was relevant to their locale. It was not, so for example, if you were on Leros Island, you were not seeing information necessarily about Lesbos Island because you're on Leros, so you should see the information that's contextual there. Now, of course, I think we have to be very mindful about the exclusion side too, right? So no fraction is complete without the denominator. And when you think about a mixed audience of people some of whom may have digital devices and some who may not, who's excluded and who is included in having access to those resources. Those are fair concerns. But I think that, that's one example of a relatively straightforward information sharing system, and that collected no personal data, right? It was basically receive only. This is where you are at this location where this hotspot is, and so here's all the resources around you. And so I think there's ways to do this, but I do think you need to actually have, in a perfect world, you should be designing with your end user absolutely at the table. I wonder if there are times where in a humanitarian emergency, whether that may not be readily available or readily practical. But again, I don't want to get into humanitarian exceptionalism either. There's always been a thread in the time I've been working with it that says that what we do is so urgent and so exceptional that we need to bypass good design practices. And I don't ever want to say the ticking time bomb scenario is never true. I'm sure there's places where it can be true, but I think that that's a real corner case. And so that we really should be seeking to design intentionally with the end user at the center of everything we're doing. And usually the end user that we're talking about for the humanitarians is either a field worker or it may be the actual affected person or the beneficiary themselves.
So, yeah, there are some comments in the chat from Jessica and Fernando around, well, we live in the digital era. This is basically like our responsibility to figure out how we work with the system and not against it. What do you think? Do you think that's even possible?
I wish I had an easy answer. It's a complicated question, and the reason I think it's complicated is, yes, to use a term, we don't have to be Luddites about this. Like, there is ways to make use of the technology that exists, but it goes back to the points that Rakesh and Dragana have been making. Is it all starts with, how is this being planned? Who is it designed for and by? How is it being deployed? What are the feedback mechanisms? Like, all of these things, it's easy to just say, we shouldn't do any technology or we should jump in. The problem is, and this is the issue, and it's not interesting, it is actually boring, but it's important. It's everything is based on the nuance of the issue, right? Like, for example, going back to the cash aid issue, it is a terrific way. It is absolutely a wonderful tool to be able to do kind of mobile banking and transfer of doing cash aid through mobile systems, because it's very efficient, it's quick, it cuts off redundancies. But the flip side of it, and somebody, there's a concern, is that, are we then building a new system of financial surveillance on the people that we're mostly, working with, or affected populations? So it's tough. It's the same. It's kind of, you flip the coin and it's heads or tails. But it doesn't mean that we have to cut off technology or have to cut off digital tools. I think what it means is that we have to be realistic and honest about what are the capacities and the limitations of these tools. We have to be open to being critiqued as a sector, and I think we don't often do that. We get a lot of pushback. And we have to also be open and sharing about critical incidents. I'll give credit to ICRC for being open about this hack. I'm willing to bet you that it's happening around every single organization around the world right now, that have had different sorts of, whether it's cyber attacks or hacks of different levels, but you don't hear about it often. You hear about it in very informal settings, in conversations happening not publicly, but it's not good enough. It has to actually be open in the public, and it has to be focused on also the affected populations whose data is being collected. So to give you the short answer is, yes, it depends. And I'm sorry, I'm an academic, and so I have to balance, I balance things. And it's not about rejecting technology or embracing technology. It's about weighing, cost benefit, doing proper risk analysis, and then coming up to decisions alongside the affected populations. If we're doing this just sitting in Geneva or New York or DC, then let's not pretend we're doing anything meaningfully good.
But maybe that's the point, because like, where are all the entrepreneurs, right? So if all of the humongous agencies with all of their legacies and all of their things and their problems and their incentives cannot move themselves to use technology in a safe, contextual way, then where are all the entrepreneurs? Maybe it's in entrepreneurs. Dragana, do you want to say something? Sorry,
yeah, interestingly, yeah, I mean, interestingly, the Luddites we oftentimes talk about as people who just didn't want to use technology, but are very misunderstood. They were breaking machinery because of owners that were breaking standard labor practices, like the social side of technology, the economic impact of these technologies, that they had no problems with the technologies themselves. And I feel like it's kind of funny that we're dealing with kind of the same issues here too. We oftentimes keep talking about this kind of in abstract ways, but it is great that ICRC was transparent about the hack, but it would be great if organizations like ICRC were transparent to begin with about practices of how they store, who they share with, and not just ICRC. I mean, even smaller organizations collect things like biometric data that ends up in the wrong hands, like we've seen in Afghanistan. Yeah, we need oversight and we need like accountability, not just among organizations, not just to employees, but we need, more importantly, no one is accountable to beneficiaries. I feel like I've been making this point for over and over again, and I'll stop now.
Well, I think that one of the challenges is that the humanitarian sector serves sort of two different constituencies that sometimes are at tension with one another. On the one hand, you have the beneficiaries who, ostensibly are the entire reason these organizations exist and their mission exists, right? These are the people that they exist to serve. But at the same time, who has the money? Who has the actual form of power in this transaction here? It's the donors, right? So we can talk about why there's such an overcollection of data in the sector, but if you double click on that, a lot of time it's donor reporting requirements, right? So USAID or Gates or whoever you want to choose, here's the whole sector is Coinopera, insert coin, get program. And along with that coin comes a whole set of reporting requirements. And so what I have real concerns about, and what I work to try and navigate through with my customers, is this notion that data collection is fundamentally extractive. So if the data is being extracted from the person on the ground, whether it's the individual worker on the ground who's working with the beneficiary or the beneficiary themselves, it's just getting tossed over the wall or getting collected into some database somewhere that never sees the light of day, probably isn't used for anything, right? So data that is never used to make a decision or actually move the needle in any fundamental way is just a collection of trivia sitting on a server somewhere. And that's not really useful. It might meet as a donor reporting requirement, but it's not, the utility of that data is very, very negligible. And so one thing that I think about, like going back to Ziad's point earlier, the feedback mechanisms and how, how is impact managed on the ground in the moments and places where this work is getting done. So if we're collecting data from the field, the aid worker, the individual caseworker on the ground, interfacing directly with the beneficiary, their work should be data informed if if data is being extracted, like that fundamentally extractive thing, what's the utility back to the mission on the ground? And ultimately, if we're providing benefit to beneficiaries with this data as opposed to just extracting it, that can actually improve the service, right? Like the idea is that, so for example, in one context around restoring family links with National Red Cross societies, one of my recent customers, the woman was actually trying to locate her teenage daughter that was in prison in another country. And this is normally a function of the Red Crescent movement. And every time this woman went to get a status update on her case, she had to basically tell her entire traumatizing story all over again, just to get a minor case update saying, oh, we have no new news for you. And so this idea of once her case is known to the aid system, she shouldn't have to re-justify why she's there over and over and over again. The system should just say, okay, this is who this person is, and we have no new updates, without having to have this person tear open her wounds all over again. So I think that there's like real harms that we're doing by poorly designing or poorly implementing systems. And we need to really bring in those capacities. The last thing I'll say is that, in my view, around 2015, the entire humanitarian sector sort of got Silicon Valley fever. We need to be more like Facebook. We need to be more like Google. And we saw this. We saw a lot of organizations around that time establishing relationship officers in the San Francisco Bay Area to interface with all these tech companies. We saw a lot of meetings being held in California that had been previously held in Geneva. And I think that we went from a sector that was not really forward thinking on technology to one where it said we need to imitate everything that Silicon Valley does. Like, you know, it goes from one extreme to the other without stopping somewhere in the middle saying, what should this actually look like relevant to us? And so I think I come back to this notion of intentionality and how we, you know, the values of Silicon Valley and Geneva may come into conflict with one another, but for the sake of the mission, whenever that happens, the values of Geneva must win out, essentially, right? The humanitarian mission can't be compromised because of this technology. It should be enabled by it. And when those challenges, those tensions happen, and they will exist, we need to have those really intense conversations up front before we're dealing with data disasters after the fact.
And Mark Zuckerberg also said, I mean, with providing free internet to, in 2016, said verbatim, you know, there are financial benefits to offering free internet to refugees. So the bottom line is always the bottom line, right? And to negotiate values of Silicon Valley, really, that kind of hockey stick profit, right? With Geneva values have to be what we're following. And it's very difficult to get partners in line when that's the case, when we also don't know what the hell they're doing with the data to begin with. When we're partnering up with somebody like Microsoft to do facial recognition on missing people, for example, and we don't really understand how the technology works, and it's not open source. That's another issue. When we're relying on proprietary tools that you know, that are free for a while and accessible to organizations. First of all, we don't see what happens to the data because we can't see the code. Secondly, oftentimes, you know, these companies will say, okay, well, you know, we're doing a stratified sort of a freemium model now where you can pay more to access the data that we already have that you stored, you know, in our systems. Another issue is with partnerships like these is ownership. Like who gets to own, you know, innovation that we work with together, you know, between Silicon Valley and humanitarian organizations that on technologies that we need, because we rely, looking at, for example, like access to Wi-Fi in camps, we rely on, and we've talked about this a lot, Rakesh, we rely on, you know, on large companies to provide both hardware, to provide training, to provide updates continually, and often and funding too. We're completely reliant on these systems. Again, no transparency, so it's kind of hard to tell what these price tags look like and what is exchanged there. But you know, in the end, it's not a sustainable system whatsoever.
So what's the way out? I think we know the problems. We at the agencies, the agency I work for, we know that there's a problem. So we've mentioned a problem of design, right? We know that there's a problem with accountability, and what I would like to know from you is, how do we develop digital transformation that aligns with who we are? I constantly talk about developing models for innovation that aligns with our mandate. We're not in the business of generating products. Therefore, we should not be doing product-based innovation. We should be doing system-based innovation because we're here to change people's lives. So how do we translate that to digital transformation? How do we come up with a model for digital transformation that aligns with who we are, recognizing that it's not stoppable, as in like the rest of the world is going in that direction, and there are certain limits to what do we do? How do we come up with a model that works? How do we fix this?
Is it fair to ask that question from you too? I know you're leading the panel, but you've had more experience than than anyone asking this question directly to people.
Do you want me to answer my own question?
Yes,
love
because
it.
we're having a conversation, right?
Love it. Love it. I can answer my own question. I think one of the answers is by trying to change the rules of the game. So when you say we buy services from companies and we have no visibility, what I would like us to do is to get into the business of intellectual property. I would like us to really understand as humanitarian agencies that when companies are doing product development, they desperately need us, our experience, our knowledge, and our access. And that should come with a cost. And the cost is intellectual property. Because when you sit at the table, when you own something, it's very different than when you're a client constantly asking for discounts, crumbles, and access. So I think we need to start by recognizing our value in the chain of product development. I also think that we need to start to recognize that competing in the back office is not where we're winning. So I think we need to politically find a solution to stop competing in the back office. And we need to start competing at the front end. So it's the value of our programs, the quality of our assistance that should be our unique selling point. How well I can collect data about people, not my selling point. How well I can register people, not my selling point. All of those things that have to do with the back office need to be mainstreamed if we're ever to be able to deliver service that is dignified, I think, to the level of speed and quality that people need, because then we would be obsessing about funding our back office, and then we would be obsessing about becoming fantastic designers. But I'm going to pass it on to you in the panel. Ziad, what do you think?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about transforming the sector and the system, I'd like to see a lot more meaningful cooperation and coordination between all the agencies on failure and critical incident issues. I think we don't. That for me is one of the things I would love to see change. I'd love to see that happen, where organizations are much more open and they're not afraid of the competition for funding or political economy of it, that I think pushes us back as a sector. What that looks like, I'm not sure. There's been some conversations happening online after ICRC hack, like, do we need a new agency? Is it part of the UN? Whatever that looks like, I think we need these mechanisms for coordination and sharing of knowledge in a better way. But then Hala, you bring up the point about also digital transformation and system-wise. I think it also, it's hard for me as a Lebanese not to think about, okay, but what is the infrastructure in the places that we're actually operating in? Right, like we talked about earlier, like low connectivity issues, like how do we actually tackle that, right? Like, do we, if we want to make meaningful progress on improving the livelihoods of individuals, like, yeah, I'm a firm believer that digital technology can help do a lot of it, but how do you do that in a country where there's 3 hours of power every day? That's it, and the internet doesn't work. And so that's a real problem. And then we haven't even touched upon the question of, what happens when organizations operate in countries where the governments, there's long-term internet shutdowns, and they're happening, I think the numbers are down in terms of frequency, but they're longer term shutdowns and not for a day or two, they're for weeks. And so that I'm not sure how we even get to deal with as a sector until we get the right people also in front. Like, the leadership has to be knowledgeable about these issues, understand technology in a meaningful way, and the social political impacts that technology have beyond just a tool for funding, programs and things like that. So I think there's also a leadership issue that we can spend hours talking upon here, but I'll stop talking now.
I actually designed, for many years, for those who don't know my background, for many years I designed networks and connectivity in these kind of challenged environments. And there are solutions. There's more solutions now than there were, 25 years ago when we first started talking about the internet in these kind of humanitarian emergencies. I do think that there's fundamentally a challenge between permissive environments versus non-permissive environments, to Ziad's point, right? So in many places where connectivity would be okay if it were practical, that's a much easier solution than an environment where, because of the conflict or because of government regulations or government is hostile to this kind of connectivity, where it's a non-permissive environment. That's a different kind of problem there. One thing that I'd love to come back to, though, is Dragana and Ziad were touching on this, and Paula, even yourself. In my estimation or my experience, I feel that there's a tension because humanitarianism kind of relies on this squishy notion of legitimacy. And I wonder if transparency and accountability are often seen as at odds with this notion of humanitarian legitimacy. So that if we share our dirty laundry, does that mean that we have been knocked off our pedestal? Right? Like, humanitarianism is always sold as one of the most noble things that humans do. And anything that sort of tarnishes that image of legitimacy, I think challenges those fundamental notions. Except, we're all human and things happen. And so I just want to point that out there. The last thing I wanted to say, and I'm going to say this purely from the private sector side, one of the things I've been asking for years is this notion of what makes for a good partnership. Like, I, from the private sector, want to partner with humanitarians so that they can accomplish their mission. I have both, business interests I need to satisfy, but there's also social impact interests that I'm supposed to satisfy. And so there's an alignment of several different motivations there. But at the same time, I want to make these partnerships and collaborations rooted in all of these tensions that we've been talking about for the past 45 minutes. I want to make sure that we're aware that at the other end of this value chain are very vulnerable people who have very little agency, safety, security, or opportunity. And so but if you go looking in the Sphere handbook, there's nothing about technology or minimum technical standards or what makes for a good partnership with non-humanitarian organizations. And this is one thing that I think that humanitarians could, use as their own experiences to help build this kind of norm and framework. Humanitarians are very used to working in conflict environments and negotiating access with different armed groups and kind of threading that needle, right? That's a thing that humanitarians are used to. So this notion of diplomacy when it comes to states or other armed factions or whatever, that's a thing that humanitarians are pretty well versed at doing. But when you think about partnerships with non-humanitarian organizations like tech companies, for example, they exist. They're private sector companies. They have stockholders, so they aren't coming from the same sort of principled basis that humanitarians are. But at the same time, there should be a way to say, look, this is what an ethical and appropriate collaboration looks like. This is how we do accountability and transparency in the midst of that collaboration. And what's really shocking to me is that while on panels like this, we can talk about it and nod our heads, when it comes down to, hey, humanitarians, put something down on paper that says, here's what an ethical and legitimate collaboration looks like, it's amazing how many people run out of the room at that point. And so while I hear that people want to have this kind of above board collaboration, and I welcome that. As a private sector person, I welcome those conversations, and I literally want to meet that bar. Humanitarians need to set the bar. I will work to meet it. But it hasn't worked out that way so far. So far, when I say please set the bar, people are very, very hesitant to even establish a bar. And so we still see these same challenges in these public-private partnerships continue. And if any of you want to work with me to change that, I welcome those conversations, those dialogues, because I think it's an urgent situation, because you're just going to see more and more private sector entities engaging in humanitarian spaces. And so I would argue the best time to solve this question would have been maybe 15 or 20 years ago, but the second best time to do it is right now.
I'm going to add just a couple of quick comments to all of these great points. To Paula, I think I completely agree with you. Treating the humanitarian sector as a legitimate actor that has expertise, because I mean, and I've written about this too. We have things to teach the private sector. So much about participatory design, about human-centered design, about how to address the needs of your end users better, because there's so much kind of spaghetti at the wall innovation in Silicon Valley. We've become actually, I mean, for how much we criticize ourselves, we've become much better at getting closer and closer to co-creation and participatory design. And on the idea of donors, a little bit to what Rakesh said, yes, humanitarianism is a very noble profession, but we need more money, and this can't come with a logo. It can't come with like it shouldn't come with we're being sponsored by Salesforce and Microsoft and others. Companies need to pay taxes, and governments should be offering more funding for this. Just period. We keep going at this as, please don't hack us. Please, can we have some more money? Please, can you see us as legitimate actors? When we already are. And lastly, when we're looking towards solutions, Paula, I want to say, building from the perspective of consent is incredibly important. When it's not possible to in emergencies, like when it's not possible to get regular input on solutions from affected communities, consent is critical of what information I'm giving out and what information I can take back about myself. Because oftentimes in emergencies, with COVID, for example, this pandemic that's so spatially I guess defined, of staying 2 meters away from each other. We still don't consider gender, for example, when we're addressing this globally. Women's shelters, domestic violence, harassment online, for disability. We're still kind of designing for the screw it, let's just get something out. Address the regular person. The regular person is always the English-speaking white guy, able, person with no visible, disabilities, and who has money. People who are in the room making the decisions. That's who we're always designing solutions for. And lastly, just very quickly, one thing. A few years ago, I did research for CG on a really great project, and interviewed a Somali refugee in Italy who volunteers to do translations for other Somali refugees, during their intake. He had to Google the data protection. He told me that he Googled the data protection, UNHCR data protection manual in English to find out how to make a complaint about somebody. And then he found out, I didn't even know this, that it's not anonymous, that you have to put your name when you're making a complaint about the person who's interviewing you, for example. And this information is not available in Somali or Amharic, or I don't think it's actually even available in Arabic. It's one of the official 6, UN languages. Who are we even offering the data protection for if we're just offering it, in English and discussing it amongst ourselves?
Yes, but whose fault is that? Because we, again, are not a company. We have a specific mandate to protect people. So if I'm not protecting people by making sure that I give them the opportunity to understand what I'm collecting, if I'm not protecting people by preparing myself so that I'm not scrambling in an emergency, but I am actually knowing what I'm doing. I mean, there's also the possibility here that we just actually need to stop pretending that the challenge is so big that it's insurmountable. So I would like us to perhaps finish this call, chat, Zoom, coffee conversation with your top 3 things that are actually solvable. 3 things that agencies need to solve so that we can move forward in digital transformation that is in alignment with our mandates digital transformation that works in the places we work with low connectivity, low energy, digital transformation that adds value to the people we're trying to serve, not value to ourselves. So, okay, it's gonna have to be like really fast because we're gonna get shut down. Here are 3 things that can be fixed. Rakesh, go.
Okay, so I think the first thing is that data collection systems should be designed for impact and utility for the individual on the ground. That means listening to the field. That means listening to beneficiaries. Second thing, with regards to data protection and security, there needs to be a humanitarian ISAC, a trusted place where a humanitarian organization can share the very technical information about data breaches in a trusted environment so that everyone can benefit. So in the case of ICRC, for example, this would be the ICRC or another similar organization could share, here's what we know, to the other peer organizations, and they can collaborate on a collective response. This model works very well in other industries. There's no real reason why it couldn't work for humanitarians. And the last thing is that we need to all collectively go back to donors and demand that they fund digital capacities, but they all understand like what the onus of their reporting requirements are putting on people on the ground. And from my discussions with donors, they are very eager for this conversation. It just hasn't been convened yet. So I think that that's also doable. And that's it. Thanks.
Ziad, here are 3 things that can be solved.
Quickly, I think first of all, implementing a duty of care approach to all our designs and data collection mechanisms. Like informed consent for me is out of the door in a lot of cases because it doesn't make sense, but a duty of care has a lot potential. Second is better transparency across the board, being open and sharing and connecting back to communities. Like that shouldn't be hard. We know where they are, we can engage them. And the third one, and I know a few people on this call will appreciate this, we need better studies and understanding of how people actually use technology and how they make use of it. So from the people affected populations to actually humanitarians on the ground who have to do this work, we need better public anthropology about digital use.
Oh, that was quick and good. Dragana.
Yeah, adding to these great points, accountability to beneficiaries. Systems built on consent. It's not going to be, consent isn't just informed, right? Consent needs to be, when you have power dynamics like these, it's never actually consent in its true form. You're not actually giving something up to, understanding what it's going to be used. You're not actually giving up data because you have a choice. Oftentimes you have 0 choice, and but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't create systems that people understand that their data is revocable, right? For example, or their data is being used in very specific ways. We've learned a lot about consent in technology, actually, from Planned Parenthood and from women's rights movements. And lastly, I want a COP. I want an oversight, humanitarian data oversight COP. I want somebody who's going to be not just auditing and publishing, every once in a while, a spicy article on the new humanitarian. I want actual meaningful change. I don't want somebody to be, ranting about how OSHA published their passwords. I want someone who's actually going to be, who has the power to make this change, because we're not getting anywhere with with the scandal that is the humanitarian publications.
Thank you. That was super inspiring, Dragana. Thank you. And thank you to all the panelists for joining me in this chat. It's been really interesting. And thank you to all the audience for your questions. You will be receiving a survey, so please make sure to tell everyone how this was the best panel you've ever been part of. And have a lovely day, everybody. Bye.